female reproductive system. So what are all the structures involved in the female reproductive system? Yes? Ovaries, then fallopian tube, then uterus, then cervix of the uterus, then vagina, then that's it. Yes? So this is the uterus, cervix of the uterus, then you have the vagina, fallopian tube, and you have the ovary. Okay, whatever the ovum is being released, it will enter into the fallopian tube. Okay, so what part of uterus is this? Fundus, body, and cervix of the uterus. Okay, clear? Yes. So this is the outline of, and this is the cervix of the uterus, and this is vagina. Okay, so this is the outline of the female reproductive tract. Okay, so in this we are going to see first how this hypothalamo pituitary ovarian axis is doing its part. So hypothalamus is going to release what hormone with respect to the reproductive system? Hypothalamus, GnRH. This is going to act on the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and this will result in the release of FSH and LH. And this FSH and LH is the one which is going to give the major role in the reproductive function. So with respect to the female reproductive hormones, okay, so we are going to consider two categories of events which is happening in the female reproductive system. One is the events happening in the ovary and the events happening in the uterus. So that is what going to talk with respect to. We are going to see only about the reproductive hormones. So for that you should know the most important event which is happening in the female reproductive system, that is menstrual cycle. Okay, so before going into this menstrual cycle, first we will see the events which is happening in the ovary. Okay, clear? So first and foremost, in the ovary you have primary follicle, and then this primary follicle will be matured and it forms the secondary follicle. Then in the secondary follicle you will be having the production of ovum. Okay, the one which is containing the ovum, matured follicle, you call it as Graafian follicle. And this Graafian follicle at one stage releases the ovum out. Okay, and now only the covering of the follicle will now becomes corpus luteum until the fertilization is taking place. If the fertilization is taking place, this corpus luteum will maintain its integrity for nearly 4 to 5 months. Okay, and then if not, this will be degraded. Okay, so this is the outline whatever is happening. Now we will see in detail the scenario what is happening in the female reproductive system. So first consider the primary follicle. So this primary follicle constitutes the outer layer called as outer cellular layer called as theca cell layer, and it is having the inner cellular layer called as granulosa cell layer, and inside this inner cell layer you have the structure called as ovum. Okay, so this is the primary follicle which we have, and now this theca cell layer is the one which produces the androgens. What are the androgens? Testosterone and androstenedione. Okay, so this single theca cell layer which is producing two different types of hormones, totally we call them as androgens, and this process is called as two hormone theory. Okay, and this theca cell layer is producing this androgens under the influence of luteinizing hormone. This luteinizing hormone is from the anterior pituitary when it is stimulated by the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so first the luteinizing hormone is acting on the theca cell layer in the primary follicle, resulting in the production of androgens, which includes testosterone and the androstenedione. Now this enters into the theca cell layer is the outer layer, and now this androgens enters into the inner cell layer called as granulosa cell layer, and this granulosa cell layer will convert the androgens into estradiol and estrogen. When it will convert? Under the influence of FSH. Okay, clear? And this estradiol and estrogen will not only from the primary follicle, some amount of the estrogen will also be from the peripheral fat tissues. Okay, clear? So now what the process where the conversion of androgens into estrogen compounds, you call that process called as aromatization, and this happens in the presence of enzyme aromatase. Okay, clear? So this is the basic thing which is happening in the level of primary follicles, and now this estrone compounds has been formed. So this is what happened in the ovary, and now we are going to see the events which is happening in the uterus during the menstrual cycle. So the start of stimulation of by the FSH. Okay, so that is considered as the day 1 of menstrual cycle. So in menstrual cycle, you have from day 1 to day 5 called as bleeding phase. From day 5 to 28, in that the 14th day we call it as day of ovulation. And from the 5th day, 6th day up to the 14th day, you term it as follicular phase. And then from 14 to 28 days, you call it as luteal phase. So now we are going to see what are all the events which is taking place in the follicular phase. Okay, clear? So follicular phase, first what happens before that? The menstruation is by the stimulation of FSH. Where it is stimulating the FSH? The FSH is now stimulating the primordial follicle in the ovary. Okay, that is the follicular stem cell. The FSH will stimulate the primordial follicle in the ovary, and this primordial follicle now will be converted into primary follicle, and this primary follicle will be further converted into Graafian follicle with the production of antral fluids. That is the fluid which is going to give the supplementation to the egg which is formed inside the follicle. And during the primary follicle production, it is going to release two types of hormones. One is estrogen and inhibin. Okay, so now this estrogen is going to give an inhibitory signal to FSH. This estrogen is giving the functions of estrogen which is released from the primary follicle is it gives inhibitory signal to the FSH. Okay, on the other hand, this gives stimulatory signal to the LH, and thirdly, this involves in the proliferation of the endometrium of the uterus. Okay, clear? So now, what is the role of this inhibin? Specifically, the inhibin which is produced in this primary follicle is inhibin B. So what is this inhibin is going to do in this function? It will inhibits the FSH. So from the primary follicle which has been formed under the stimulation of FSH, from the primordial follicle you will get the primary follicle. The formed primary follicle will releases estrogen and inhibin B. This estrogen is having three different aspects of functions. So one is the inhibitory signal to the FSH, and it will stimulate the luteinizing hormone. Along with this, it will proliferate the endometrium. All these follicular state is happening in the ovary, and the formed estrogen from the ovary, it is having its role in the proliferation of endometrium, that is at the level of uterus. Okay, so that is proliferation of endometrium. The thickening of the wall of the endometrium of uterus is taking place in the follicular stage. How this is taking place is because of the events happening in the ovary, and those events releasing the hormone, and that is acting on the uterus. Okay, so this is the major things which is happening in the proliferation of endometrium. And now next thing is the Graafian follicle will be formed. When the Graafian follicle will be formed? When the primary follicle becomes matured, you will get the Graafian follicle. And when will you consider that is Graafian follicle and it is a matured follicle? The normal size of the Graafian follicle will be 20 mm. Okay, and this is the maximum size of the Graafian follicle you will obtain. When you will obtain this maximum size? Only just before ovulation. Okay, and this event before ovulation, increase in the size of the Graafian follicle, it is stimulated under the influence of LH. So there will be LH surge just before the ovulation. This surge of LH, it is also influenced by estrogen. The estrogen is the one which is giving positive stimulus to the LH, and this LH surge is also indirectly helping the Graafian follicle to increase in the size, that is just before the ovulation. And what is the duration when you will get the LH surge? It is only 32 to 36 hours before ovulation. All these durations you have to remember always. These things will be repeatedly, you have to revise, because when you are studying OB-GYN, all these things will be taken into consideration. That is the high yield topic for FMGE. Okay, that is why I am going in depth of this menstrual cycle. If you just want to study physiology, I can just finish off menstrual cycle in 5 minutes. But what are all the events happening in the menstrual cycle, the hormonal events? You should know, then only you can prescribe the drugs in OB-GYN. Okay, clear? So, the maximum size of graph, all these questions will not be asked under the subject physiology, but the questions will be asked under OB-GYN. Clear? So, listen carefully. So the maximum size of the Graafian follicle is 20 mm, and this is happening just before ovulation under the influence of LH surge. And LH surge, when the LH surge can be seen, is only 32 to 36 hours before ovulation. And this LH surge is due to the influence of estrogen. And this rise in the LH surge, so you will get the LH surge like this, and this is the point where the ovulation is going to take place, and this sudden rise of LH surge makes the Graafian follicle to release the ovum. Okay, clear? And here we have seen the estrogen effect to get the LH surge. So what is the maximum concentration of estrogen you can see during the LH surge is 200 picogram per ml. When you will get the estrogen peak, the duration is 10 to 11, on the 10th to 11th day of menstrual cycle, and this will remain for next 48 hours. Okay, clear? So this is the hormonal events which is happening in the follicular phase. So far what we have seen is only the follicular phase. Now the ovulation is happened, and next we are going to see with the luteal phase. Clear with the follicular phase? Any doubt in the follicular phase? Yes. Remember all the measurements, the durations and the values of estrogen, LH surge, when it is present, how long it is present, why it is present. Okay, LH surge is due to the influence of estrogen, and estrogen is maintaining its peak value of, what is the value? 200 picograms per ml. How long estrogen peak is maintained? From which day to which day of menstrual cycle? 10th to 11th day of menstrual cycle. From 10th to 11th day, how long it is maintaining the peak value? For 48 hours. And what is the main function of estrogen in the uterus? Proliferation of the endometrium, follicular phase, or you can also tell it as proliferatory phase. Yes or no? We have two different terminologies for the same phase. Either it is follicular phase or the proliferatory phase. Why? Because the events happening in the ovary, you call it as follicular phase. At the same time, there is also proliferation of the endometrium of the uterus, so you call it as proliferatory phase. And now at the end of proliferatory phase, ovulation is done. And now we are going to enter into the luteal phase, which is also called as secretory phase. Luteal phase in respect to the ovary. Because once when the Graafian follicle release the ovum, now it was going to convert into corpus luteum. What the corpus luteum is going to do? That is what we are calling as luteal phase. And after the ovum is released, and what are the events going to happen in the uterus? The secretory function of the uterus. So you call it as secretory phase. So now we will enter into the secretory phase or luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so this is just after ovulation is done. Okay, so the Graafian follicle now becomes corpus luteum. Okay, and this will maintain as corpus. Here is the day 14, ovulation. After the ovulation, you are getting the Graafian follicle as corpus luteum. And this will go on up to how many days? 28 days of the menstrual cycle. And this corpus luteum, in the meantime, what are all the functions it is going to mediate? It will also produce estrogen, progesterone, along with this inhibin A. There you have seen inhibin B. Okay, and what is this 3 going to do now? Estrogen in the proliferatory phase, what kind of effect it is given to the LH? It stimulates the LH in the proliferatory phase. But in case of luteal phase, it will have inhibitory effect because no need for LH surge after the ovulation. Okay, so it gives inhibitory effect, and that inhibitory effect is also given from the progesterone to the luteinizing hormone. And the other function of progesterone in respect to the uterus is it supports the endometrium to maintain its secretions and the contents. So now in the proliferatory phase, endometrium is fully grown and it is fully thick. We don't know whether the fertilization is going to happen or not. So if the fertilization is going to happen, the progesterone, its main role is to support the endometrium. So it will wait until 28 days. If the fertilization is taking place, the support given by the progesterone makes the fertilized zygote to fix for the implantation process. So we don't know whether the fertilization will happen or not. So on the whole, the progesterone will maintain the endometrium. So it supports the endometrium. and the progesterone will reach the maximum level mainly on day 22 of the menstrual cycle or day 8 after ovulation. Both are same. You can get in either way, day 22 of menstrual cycle or day 8 of the after ovulation. Okay, and what is the normal value of progesterone which is maintained over here is 40 nanomole per liter. Okay, so this will be starting its maximum secretion 36 hours before ovulation itself. The synthesis of progesterone synthesis started 36 hours before ovulation, and at day 2 or day 8 after ovulation you will get the maximum value of progesterone. So these are the events happening until the 28 days of menstrual cycle. And if there is no fertilization, what is going to happen is the corpus luteum degraded. So the contents released by the corpus luteum, estrogen and progesterone, now it is not going to release estrogen and progesterone. So the role of progesterone is to support the endometrium. If there is no corpus luteum, no progesterone, no support to the endometrium, resulting in bleeding phase. Again, this is after 28 days, day 1 of menstrual cycle begins. So the bleeding phase is due to the withdrawal of progesterone. Okay, clear? So the bleeding phase here is due to the progesterone withdrawal. Remember that. Why the bleeding phase? Because of the withdrawal of progesterone. Okay, clear? Then again the cycle begins. Okay, now you people know what is the role of estrogen on the uterus and in the ovary, the role of progesterone on the uterus and in the ovary. So this completes the hormone physiology of reproductive system. So up to this we will wind up with today's class. So tomorrow we have 2 more topics, renal physiology and central nervous system. Inhibin A, it also gives inhibitory signal to the luteinizing hormone. So all on the overall, the luteinizing hormone is not having any role after ovulation. Okay, clear? Yes? If it is fertilized, then the corpus luteum will be maintained until the development of placenta to supplement estrogen and progesterone. So the progesterone has to be maintained always to support the endometrium for the implanting zygote. So it has to protect the newly forming zygote. And after the development of placenta, the corpus luteum will become corpus albicans and it will get degraded. Why? Because the placenta take part the role of producing estrogen and progesterone, which will further supports the endometrium. Okay, in detail of all those things, fertilization and how it is maintaining the endometrial growth, everything we will see in OB-GYN. Okay, clear? So any doubts? What happens if it is fertilized or not fertilized? What is the role of estrogen? What is the role of progesterone? And why if the person is having abnormal menstruations, and I will give you the terminologies, what are the events or the terminations when the person is having abnormal bleeding. We have some terminologies for that. Dysmenorrhea. What is dysmenorrhea? Painful menstruation. And what is metorrhagia?
Irregular bleeding.
Good. Irregular cycle. And what is hypomenorrhea?
Less days of bleeding.
The menstrual bleeding will be less than 50 ml. In definition, if you say the cycle length remains altered. Okay, the person will have less than 50 ml of bleeding. For example, if normally the person is using the 2 to 3 pads per day, in this case less than 50 ml, only 1 pads per day. And if the duration of bleeding is, for example, 7 days, the person will have the bleeding exactly for the 7 days, but the volume of the blood which is being bleeding is decreased. So the cycle length remains unaltered. Okay, so that is hypomenorrhea. It is unaltered. Okay, clear? So these are some terminations with respect to the irregular menstrual bleeding. Okay, clear? Yes.